So it's a pleasure to have you here. It's been 10 years since we met, and I've seen the movement of your career from traditional asset management to impact investing.
Yeah.
So we will be listening to you and your presentation.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to the CFA Society for inviting me here. What I'd like to make a point here that I'm a businessman. My background is asset management and wealth management. I'm not an environmentalist. I'm not an advocate. I'm here to give you my perspective of where sustainable investing is going. My perspective is Europe, UK, and US, and it'd be interesting for the panels this afternoon to discuss the extent to which how this relates to Turkey. I represent the Impact Investing Institute, which it was founded last month, so we haven't got a large list of achievements to report yet. It is the merger of the Implementation Task Force on Growing a Culture of Social Impact Investing, which Prime Minister Theresa May commissioned last year, and then National Advisory Board on Impact Investing, which is part of a global network of advisory boards. What we're trying to do is strengthen the market infrastructure for impact investing. We're trying to bring more capital into the market. We're trying to bring in capital that is effective, so not just the volume of capital, but the effectiveness of the capital. But we also have a mission to democratize impact investing. So the question is, how do we engage retail investors? We have support from several government departments, including the Department for International Development and the City of London, which is a unique municipal entity that supports the financial services market in the UK. Now, I'd like to start by giving you a framework for thinking about impact investing and sustainable investing. And let me just ask you, by a show of hands, how many of you recognize this spectrum of capital? Okay, so my recommendation, I'd like to spend a few minutes on it, but my recommendation is go to Google afterwards, Google spectrum of capital into the image view, and take a look. It's a really helpful framework, and I'll explain why. So what this shows is the range of choices and strategies that an investor can take. On the left-hand side, traditional targets competitive risk-adjusted financial returns, no consideration of impact whatsoever. On the right-hand side is philanthropy, where you have an investment return of minus 100%, but the expectation is that you avoid harm, benefit stakeholders, and contribute to solutions in quite an intense way. And in between is a spectrum of choices. So if you are moving away from traditional into responsible, responsible refers to avoiding harm. So avoiding things that, it could be fossil fuels, it could be gambling, it could be weapons, it could be any number of things. Moving farther to the right, you get into something we call sustainable, which is a more proactive seeking out of opportunity, financial opportunity, but also looking for people, looking for companies that are providing solutions. Move further to the right into the area that we think of as impact, pure impact, where you're positively contributing to solutions. We tend to think of this as new capital coming into the market rather than old capital. But there's a finance first. You can see that column, finance first, means that you're looking for market returns. You're not making concessionary investments. Move farther to the right and you get impact first. With impact first, you may well be looking to make concessionary investments. And then finally into philanthropy. But what's interesting about this chart helps, I think, remove some of the confusion around labels. And I'll give you an example. When somebody says, if you make a sustainable investment or an impact investment, you have to sacrifice return. Yes, you do. No, you don't. Yes, you do. And you have these pointless discussions. What this does is says, if you want to invest in it for a concessionary return, you may. That's impact first. If you don't want to, you don't have to, by being at this end, finance first, or in the sustainable and responsible category. So it's just a useful framework to think about the entire ecosystem. And generally speaking, what's happening is that the market is moving into impact. So asset managers and asset owners are moving to the right. And by the way, philanthropy 2.0 is moving toward investment at the same time. So philanthropy 2.0 looks an awful lot like investing. It uses the same tools as investing. It does the same research. It requires the same resources. It does the due diligence. It questions management. It looks for the outcomes. It looks for accountability for the outcomes. Basically, philanthropy 2.0 is investing. It's just that the return expectation is very different. Now, in this move to the right, effectively what's happening is that this area is being vacated. And so most global asset managers today are in the responsible and sustainable space, which is to say that they're looking to exclude, using ESG criteria to exclude investments that are a bad idea and use it as a tool to find investments that are a good idea. This is called ESG integration, i.e. integrating ESG considerations into your management. And I would say that global asset managers are almost all there, and if they're not there, they will be in the next 1 or 2 years. Now, we conducted a unscientific poll. So last week I was at a conference called Pensions for Purpose. So these are pension funds that are purposeful. And we asked them, where are you? And this is what they said. So you can see that the center of gravity is in the responsible and sustainable space, with a little bit more into the higher impact space. That's where progressive pension funds in the UK are today. Then we asked them, where are you going to be in 3 years? And the shift to the right is dramatic. So the center of gravity has moved for these pension funds, completely evacuating traditional, completely evacuating responsible. And the center of gravity for pension, for at least this group of pension funds, is now in the sustainable and the impact space, with some being even more adventurous than that. Now, what's causing this momentum? What is causing all this energy? The answer is climate change. Climate change has changed the story because ESG has been around for decades. People have been investing with ESG, that product category has been available for several decades, largely ignored in certain markets. It's stronger in some markets in Europe and weaker in others. So what's different today? And the answer is climate change has created that link between a social requirement and capital. Because everybody understands climate change, everybody understands that large amounts of money are necessary to fix climate change, and everybody understands that the large pools of capital, in addition to government, are going to be asset owners and asset managers throughout the world. So insurance companies, asset managers, wealth managers, pension funds. So what's happened is that climate change has created an awareness of the link between capital and solving problems, because it's really obvious for CO2 emissions. The metrics are easy. Everybody understands that. But what happens is the other SDGs are now dropping into that slipstream, and they will follow climate change. Institutional investors now must deal with climate change. Here's a chart from something called the Thinking Ahead Institute, which is run by the investment consultant Willis Towers Watson. And it shows their ranking of the extreme risks for institutional investors from 2009 to present. And you can see on the right-hand side that climate change was number 7th. It's moved up the ranks and is now in number 1 position. Now, what's interesting about this chart is that if you look at the other inhabitants of this chart on the left, currency crisis, trade collapse, depression, banking crisis, sovereign default, these are classic financial issues, financial risks. And now what we're saying is, according to this institute, which reflects, I think, the views of institutional investors, is that now climate change is the top of this list. So it's not surprising that prudential regulators today are really interested in climate change, because if a prudential regulator is interested in a banking collapse or a sovereign default or cyber warfare, then a prudential regulator is going to be very interested in climate as well. On the retail side, that link has not yet been made, but it will. And it will because people will start to prod and promote and educate and stimulate retail demand. This is a chart from Nordea, tapping into the interest that all consumers have to reduce their CO2 emissions, or at least reduce their CO2 footprint. So when you think about, they added up, they said, what would happen if you shortened your showers by 2 minutes, took 1 less international flight per year, took the train instead of the car, and just ate 1 piece of meat each week? What would your impact be on CO2 emissions? Or what would the impact be on your CO2 footprint? And then they compared that to what would happen if the average Swedish worker moved his pension pool into a low-carbon investment. So that message to retail consumers is starting to get made that if you really want to do something about CO2, there is now an instrument available, which is your investment portfolio, your pension portfolio, that allows you to respond to that in a very compelling way. And you can argue about the methodology. I would urge you, if you're interested in this, to go to Nordea's website and Google 27 times. Morgan Stanley did a survey of US high net worth investors. What's interesting about this chart is, first of all, I think it's really interesting that 71% in 2015 of people were very interested or somewhat interested in the question, how interested are you in sustainable investing, which is the practice of making investments in companies or funds which aim to achieve market rate financial returns while pursuing positive social and/or environmental impact. 70% of people, when asked, said yes, I'm either somewhat or very interested. That went up in 2017, a little bit, but look at the jump to 2019. And that jump, the difference between 2017 and 2019, is largely due to the impact, the focus that has been put on the climate crisis. That's what's made the difference. On the right-hand side, you find the subset of millennials, and you can see that millennials, not surprisingly, are ahead in all categories from the general population. So what this means is that when you prompt retail investors, this is the way they respond, because normally retail investors are quite inert, they're passive. But when you prompt them, this is the answer that comes back. And importantly, the millennial generation feels even stronger about this. So the demographic backdrop to this attitude change, I think, is really quite strong and multi-decade. Now, instead of showing you yet another survey, what I'd like to do is I'd like you to spend 2.5 minutes with me with some UK consumers, naive, non-specialist UK consumers, talking about pensions. Can we roll the video, please?
That's the dream, yeah. Tell me about it.
That sounds amazing, doesn't it? That sounds quite a fairy tale.
I would wonder why I hadn't been told about it already.
It doesn't sound like it can or should work.
You mean my pension hot before I've even touched it?
I had absolutely no idea that my pension was being invested at all.
I didn't really read the small print or understand.
It actually never occurred to me before that my pension could be something that would create change.
I'd probably be surprised about my pension being something making a difference, because I think most people don't know what their pension's investing in.
Well, I would want a very specific breakdown of where my money is going to, how it's being invested.
It would be good to know more about the companies that my pension is being invested in, whether they're doing good in the world.
Who are they? Who are they run by? What are they doing? Where are they?
What? Invest in these.
You're reading it's like a list of horror.
Everything about it is vile.
Making weapons and ammunition, it's a no-go.
There's none that I would feel comfortable.
None of these things I want my potential kids to grow into a world for. Cigarette companies, coal mines, oil companies, gambling. No way. No. You can have your list back.
I feel like something better could be done with my money.
Oh, well, there you go. That is a stunning list of good things. Yeah, if my pension went to these things, that would be a wonderful, wonderful thing.
So on this list, these are all projects and ideas that I would definitely back. I would definitely support social housing, infrastructure like schools and hospital.
I would definitely want my money to be invested in building wind farms and tackling climate change.
And companies that treat their workers well. This is my kind of list.
And I, as a kind of customer, can feel, first of all, better about where my money is going, but also you would assume that those pensions would do actually quite well, probably make more money ultimately.
My money going into this, will I get a return? That's the first thing I'd think of.
Okay. Now, this is a naive audience. These are non-specialists. These are people that they interviewed off the street. And I'm not, naive in the sense that you can't build a portfolio out of renewables and solar. That's not a portfolio. But I think the sentiment here is quite interesting, that when asked, consumers do respond. So a couple things I'd observe about that. First of all, they're unaware of the potential of capital. Okay, that awareness has not come yet, but it is coming, and climate is what's communicating that. They prefer values-aligned investing when they're asked. Interestingly, some aren't even aware that their pensions are invested. Some people just thought that they arrive, and I think that's kind of an interesting starting point in terms of, my next point is that they need more information. They would welcome more information. And then finally, I would just mention, and they also divert, as a naive approach, they divert to divestment. So they say, just get rid of these. I want to invest in the good things and not invest in bad things, which is not really the way you construct a portfolio. And then the question about, well, do I have to give up return? Does one person said that would be a better return for me. The other one said, not so sure. So you get a flavor about where the retail mindset is. Morgan Stanley asked a bunch of US high net worth investors what they thought. The question was, there are many reasons why firms adopt sustainable investing practices. What do you believe are the primary reasons firms adopt sustainable investing practices? And this was an audience, it was 300 asset managers with a bit of a emphasis on sustainable investing. So they tend to emphasize the sustainable piece. But even this audience, the top 3 reasons were commercial reasons for moving into this space. So they were about attracting assets because their client base expects it, because there's growth potential. These are the commercial reasons why US asset managers are now starting to think about moving into this space. And it's showing up in product flows. So, there's 1,000 of these I could show you, but the one on the top right is assets in ESG-oriented ETFs. And what you can see is the real pop in the last year or so, which is asset managers deciding that this is now a trend, this is moving forward, and that's what that looks like. On the bottom left is a more rounded view. This is all sustainable funds flows in the US, so much broader universe. But you can see since 2013 has been positive with something of a pop again in the first part of 2019. Now this is one of the scariest slides I've ever had to look at, because my background is asset management and wealth management. The European Commission's Sustainable Finance Action Plan requires asset managers to disclose and report on their process to identify and mitigate adverse sustainability risk for all their investments, whether they're sustainable investments or mainstream investments. That's not really an issue. Any asset manager that's gone through ESG integration is prepared to do this. That's fine, not a problem, not too much work. Compliance department can handle it. The scary part is the second one. Financial advisors throughout Europe, and I don't know how many there are, but there are 20,000 in the UK, will be required to ask clients about their ESG preferences, and then they must take them into account when they offer them a product. Now that is scary, because as somebody who used to run a wealth management business in the UK, the notion that I had to train 225 client advisors on how to understand ESG, understand the depth of ESG, entertain questions from clients, and then respond appropriately. But then in addition, I have to build an entire product portfolio that's suitable for those preferences as articulated, which means I'm going to have to completely redo my product offering. That's the scary part. But again, it comes back to this notion, when you ask clients and they come back with an answer, in Europe, starting in probably 2021, it will be illegal to not offer them some form of ESG investment. And that's really quite impactful. There's lots that hasn't been resolved. I'm going to list some of these. I don't know, perhaps in the afternoon panels there'll be some discussion of divestment versus engagement as a strategy. What is the link between risk return and fiduciary responsibility? Is there a supply of appropriate investments? And where is that supply? If the demand goes up, where is that supply going to come from? Is it Turkey, for example? The whole area of impact measurement is still a work in progress, with lots of different methodologies, lots of different terminology, and a lack of appropriate data. And as asset managers move into this space, then greenwashing becomes an issue. And then you saw the retail investors, but really everybody in the entire industry, including asset management professionals, need more knowledge and expertise. And I think the CFA Society has now introduced an ESG module that I think is part of that education program. And then finally, I leave this, I heard somebody call it the elephant in the room, which is what is the difference between the impact that a company has and the impact that the investor capital has, because those aren't the same things, and that's not a question that's really been satisfactorily resolved yet in the market. So I'll leave it at that. I hope we can pick up some of these questions later on in the panels, but in the meantime, if you have any questions, or I'd be happy to talk.
Yeah, so I may have a few questions. So about maybe I can start with the Impact Investing Institute.
Yes.
So it's a very new one, as far as I know, and you're a working group head there, and you're an advisor there. And so what's the purpose of Impact Investing Institute?
Well, we're trying to, I talked about trying to improve the market infrastructure, which includes the setting of standards. It includes vehicle development, so what kind of vehicles do you build that would actually accept this kind of investment? What is an education program? I mean, fundamentally, we think that the greatest amount of capital will move in if we can get asset managers, wealth managers, and pension funds much more deeply engaged in considering impact investing, because we know that all of these entities can do impact investing. It's just some of them haven't gotten there yet. They don't have the knowledge, they don't have the will, they don't have the momentum, and so we're trying to think of ways to move that forward, particularly, I would say, with defined contribution pension plans.
Yeah, so it's very important, I believe. Pension pools are the long-term pools that has a great transformation power. Yeah. And so some of the phrases that I quote from the interviews is changing the world. So is it a thing that you attracted to impact investment from the traditional asset management?
Me personally?
Yeah, you personally. I'm curious.
As I say, I'm not an environmentalist. I don't hug trees, but it just feels as if there are some pretty large problems out there that could be addressed effectively by rethinking how we deploy capital. Yeah. So I think it's the size of the problem and the availability of a solution that tempts me the most. It's just absolutely intriguing to imagine if you could redirect some of this investment into the right direction, you could take a good step towards solving some of the problems.
So I have a question, so maybe we can extend this question to the audience as well. So if you have two alternative investments with equal returns, equal risk profiles, and one will have a good impact on the world, which one would you choose? So you can, second one, first one? So I think we should be courageous to pick the second one. So there's a problem. So do you think impact investment is being embraced sufficiently by the community, investment community?
No, absolutely not. I think the investment community has embraced the notion of ESG integration. Yeah. So I think the consideration of ESG issues in terms of what you avoid and what you embrace, that is there. But the step beyond to actually proactively solving problems, I think, has yet to happen.
And the climate change, I think one of the most important themes in impact investing is climate change, but it's not limited to climate change as far as I know. So the economic growth is, for an emerging market, the poverty is one of the biggest social problems, and we have to create impact to solve that problem. But affordable and clean energy, and sustainable communities, responsible consumption, infrastructure, and those type of, but energy transformation, I think, is the most critical one. So what do you want to say about that?
In addition to being the most critical one, I mean, my view would be it's the most critical issue, is the issue of climate change. But it also happens to be the one with the simplest and most understandable metric, which is CO2 emissions. So, and it's also the easiest to introduce into the financial system. So you can get climate derivatives, you can get green bonds in a way that you can't really apply the same methodology to other problems. And that's why I say that it's CO2 that's opened the door. The others will take longer to find the right financial instruments, the right vehicles, and the right way to measure impact and communicate impact. It'll take them much longer because it's a much more complex environment.
So from Turkey's perspective, there are questions about Turkey, so I should extend those questions as well. So Turkey is an emerging market.
Yeah.
And so is it going to become difficult for Turkey to attract more capital because of a new constraint of ESG? So this is one side. So on the other side, so if Turkey can decarbonize its economy, then it will eliminate one of the biggest problems of its current account deficit. So what do you think? How do you?
One of the reasons,
what would you recommend to Turkey?
Well, so one of the reasons that we were sponsored by the Department for International Development is that DFID believes that we can contribute to moving capital into developing economies. So that's clearly part of our agenda, is to figure out how to get capital into these areas. And I think that there are countries now that are thinking of ways to make them more appealing to impact investors. In other words, paying attention to what it is to measure your impact, what it is to report your impact. Because if you can take some of the activity that you do in your in these economies and correctly frame it in a way that describes what impact you're having, then that will start to attract capital. And I think DFID would be an example of an organization that is looking to put capital in there and looking to crowd in institutional capital. So it's not just their capital, they're trying to get other investors in, to the extent that Turkey or any other country can define for itself a credible, sustainable investment set. I would expect that to attract capital that it wasn't going to attract otherwise.
Thank you very much, Jamie. So thank you very much for the presentation and being with us and sharing with your thoughts with us. Thank you very much.